As intellectual beings, we can live in the present and also in the past and future, as well as in imaginary worlds, and we transcend our present moment. So, ideality of meaning, secondly, human recollection. And my third example might be more controversial. Consider the form of inner time consciousness. That's sort of the extreme of Husserl's explorations. This is the deepest layer of consciousness. It's deeper than perception, reflection, memory, and imagination. And Husserl arrives at it by contrasting it with remembering. This is the kind of the constant form of even behind our perceptions and behind our memories. It's what allows something to be experienced as temporal, as extending in time. And of course, one of Husserl's great contributions is to have shown that this is not a static atomic thing, but that it's distended with protension, retention, and that form is always the same with a marvelous combination of stability and flow. So such inner time, this is the deepest layer of consciousness, and Husserl arrives at it by contrasting it with remembering, with recollection. Such inner timing takes place in the living present. This elementary flow, as well as the form that orders this flow, there is a form there. But what kind of form? How different from forms of tables or of trees? Is beneath everything. It's beneath the ego itself. It is pre-egological, anonymous, he sometimes calls it, or pre-personal. And we might be tempted to think that it is common to all conscious creatures. We might want to think that this kind of early form of temporality occurs even in animals, and that it's merely the lowest, deepest level of sensibility. But I would suggest that it should not be read this way. I would suggest that inner timing is the awareness, differentiation, and flowing that is proper to the intellect in time. Just as human remembering is the intellect embodied in imagination, so inner temporality is the intellect as simply embodied in matter and motion. My remarks are somewhat speculative. I'm not aware of texts of Husserl where he says whether or not this level of awareness is common to animals and to men. But since inner time consciousness is played off against human remembering and understood in relation to it, I would like to think that it is the elementary form of mind and not just the elementary form of sensibility. It's the space in which the most basic distinctions are made, where identity and difference, rest and motion, and presence and absence first come to light. It's the simplest form of othering and gathering. The more complicated versions of these forms, such as those found in science, rhetoric, and dialectics, find their origin here. Inner time consciousness is the root for categorical activity. So that's my third example, ideality of meaning, recollection, and inner time consciousness as ways in which Husserl talks about the anthropology of nous. I've briefly discussed three Husserlian themes, and I have claimed that they are all instances of his analysis of intellect as intellect. Still other topics could be listed and interpreted this way, and it shows how rich Husserl's analyses are. For example, our ability to see things as pictures, our Bildbewusstsein, is achieved by intellect and not by sensibility. To be able to identify something as an image of something else, in Husserl's terms, to see a Bildobjekt as depicting a Bildsujet, and to see the image as conveying not just a reminder of that depicted object, but as presenting it under a certain angle and with a certain slant, to see it with a certain meaning. All this is the work of intellect and not just sensibility. Intellect is not only that which predicates and makes propositions and logic. It operates in all these different ways. This pictorial intentionality can well be elaborated in contrast with the kind of intentionality at work in the use of words. Words and pictures really have to be understood in contrast with one another. You can't really understand how words function without asking how pictures function. Also, Husserl's analysis of corporeality explores the way intellect or reason works in regard to the body in which it is found. To hold sway, Walten is his word, within our own bodies, as contrasted with the way we are involved with other material things that are outside our bodies. Again, intellect embodied. Still another intellectual capacity that Husserl has explored lies in our ability to count and to calculate with numbers, to carry out the special kind of syntax that occurs in mathematics and in measurement. It seems to me that it would be very useful to compare the categoriality that occurs in counting and measurement with the categoriality that occurs in predication. In what sense does an enumeration articulate parts within a whole, and in what sense is it an assertion and a form of doxic belief? There's a kind of doxa in mathematical equations. You can summarize this question, I think, in a very interesting way, an issue to be explored. How does an equation differ from a sentence? If you want to talk about how math and philosophy and human knowing are related, it's good to target something very concrete like that. How is an equation different from a sentence? And just to mention one more activity of intellect, consider the distinction that Husserl makes right at the beginning of logical investigations, the distinction between Ausdruck and Anzeige, between expression and indication. This is an extremely basic distinction that works very deeply in human thinking. It's illuminating to think of the shifts between the two modes of intending associated with these two kinds of signs. An Ausdruck being a word, especially, and an Anzeige being a flag or a mark of some sort. It would also be valuable to play off these two forms of presence against pictures and images. We take all these intentionalities in their relation with one another, and we understand what it is to be a human being. Consider, for example, a picture that serves not really to depict its object, but merely to remind us of it, such as the silhouette of a famous person imprinted on a coin. It's not really a picture of that person, it's more a reminder, but it's not a word either. As Husserl observes in his treatment of images, sometimes a very small picture might serve more as a reminder and hence as an Anzeichen and not as an image. All these forms can then be interwoven with names and thereby lifted into and mixed with categorical thinking or linguistic syntax. Tracing these filigrees of signification and parts and wholes is an exercise in metaphysics as well as in the theory of knowledge. It describes the identity of things and shows how such identity is displayed. It's not epistemology in a pejorative sense. It's not an attempt to prove that we really do know things, but it's rather a contemplative theoretic activity that resembles what is done in Aristotle's categories and metaphysics, as well as in works like Plato's Cratylus, Theaetetus, and Sophist. It deals with truth and with the being of things, with how they exist and how they are presented, and it enters into first philosophy, into a form of thinking beyond which no further kinds of questions can philosophically be asked. I have another quotation from Leo Strauss that can help us clarify what Husserl's work accomplishes. It comes from another one of his letters to Eric Vogelin, this time in 1943, in May. Vogelin had objected to what he called the egological and epistemological focus of Husserl's work, and he observed that Husserl's thought seemed somewhat Averroistic to him. And Strauss replied, quote, "I think it's impossible to call Husserl's procedure Averroistical. There is no ego of fundamental significance in Averroes." As we know, according to Averroes, we as human beings do not carry out intellectual activities. According to him and his reading of Aristotle, thinking is done by a separate intellect which transcends us. We provide the imagination and the phantasms, which are bodily forms of consciousness, but the separate mind does the thinking in and for us. The thinking that takes place in us is not really our own. We don't own it. This remark of Strauss is very perceptive. It indicates that Husserl does recognize an ego as an agent of intellectual activity. He calls it the transcendental ego. Husserl's concept of ego is sometimes misunderstood. It's taken to be a kind of detached, or at least detachable entity, an ego pole, something pure and simple and beyond time and space, a kind of philosophical construct detached from history. But nothing could be further from the truth. In Husserl, the ego is presented and analyzed with great subtlety, and the many obscurities and special forms of absence that pervade it are acknowledged. For Husserl, the ego shows up most vividly as the agent behind categorial activities. It accomplishes judgments and measurements and reflects on its own categorial actions. It also recognizes itself as the same in remembered, anticipated, and imagined situations. In fact, I would say that in the displacements that occur within inner time, the ego is not just the present ego that remembers, projects, and imagines, nor the past ego that is remembered, projected, or imagined. Rather, it's the identity constituted between these two modes. In other words, when Husserl says in memory, we recall our past selves, then one might be tempted to say, well, the past self is my real self, or say, no, it's my present self, that's the real self. But really, it's the identity between the two that is the self. We are our past, and it's there for us. This is structurally extremely profound in Husserl. And then, of course, there is the pre-egological level of inner time consciousness out of which the ego comes to stand, and at the other extreme there's philosophical reflection, in which the ego enhances itself even beyond the structures of categorical thinking, and in which it takes possession of its own being and of the world as that which is presented to us. In differentiating all these dimensions, Husserl tries to bring to presence what we are as responsible agents of truth. So that concludes my second section, some passages from Leo Strauss to try to explore a bit how Husserl does recover the understanding of mind and being.